There are crimes so profoundly disturbing that even history tries to bury them in silence. In the autumn of 1846, in the cotton fields of Montgomery County, Alabama, a plantation owner named Cornelius Whitmore conducted what he called agricultural experiments on human beings he owned as property. But this wasn't about crops or soil quality. This was about bloodlines, about creating what he termed superior specimens through forced breeding programs that violated every boundary of human decency. And the most chilling part? The women he systematically bred weren't strangers he'd purchased at auction. They were his own daughters. If you have the courage to keep listening, know this. What you're about to hear isn't just a story about slavery's brutality. It's about a man who turned his plantation into a laboratory of genetic horror, where his children became experiments, and where the line between father and monster disappeared entirely. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of America's antebellum South? Join this investigation, subscribe now, and comment your location below. Picture Montgomery County, Alabama in the 1840s. The air itself seems to shimmer with heat and humidity, thick enough to taste. Cotton stretches in endless white rows across rolling hills, each boll representing someone's stolen labor, someone's broken back, someone's shattered dreams. This is the Deep South at the height of King Cotton's reign, where plantations operate as self-contained kingdoms and their owners wield power that would make medieval lords envious. The Whitmore plantation sprawls across 1,800 acres of prime black belt soil, so named for its dark, fertile earth, and for the overwhelming population of enslaved African Americans who work it from sunup to long past sundown. Spanish moss drapes from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds. The plantation bell rings out to mark the rhythms of forced labor. Wake, work, brief rest, more work, collapse into exhausted sleep. Now, you have to understand something crucial about this era. Slavery in 1846. America isn't just economically entrenched, it's scientifically justified by the era's leading minds. Phrenology, the pseudoscience of measuring skulls to determine intelligence and character, is taught at prestigious universities. Medical journals publish research claiming to prove black inferiority. Ministers preach sermons citing biblical passages to sanctify human bondage. Into this world of normalized atrocity steps Cornelius Whitmore, a second-generation plantation master who inherited his father's land, his father's slaves, and apparently his father's complete absence of conscience. To his neighbors, Cornelius Whitmore is a model Southern gentleman. He's 42 years old in 1846, tall and distinguished with graying temples and the kind of commanding presence that fills doorways. He wears impeccably tailored suits, even in Alabama's suffocating heat. He quotes Shakespeare and Greek philosophers at social gatherings. He serves on the county agricultural board and contributes essays to Southern farming journals about crop rotation and soil management. His plantation runs with clockwork efficiency, no rebellions, no runaways, no scandals that reach public ears. Other plantation owners seek his advice. He's known as an innovator, someone who applies scientific thinking to agricultural challenges. His white peers see him as enlightened, progressive even, because he doesn't whip his slaves as frequently as some neighbors do. He speaks of humane management practices and optimizing human resources. He's married to Catherine Whitmore, a mobile banking family's daughter, who brought a substantial dowry to the marriage. They have 2 legitimate children, both sons, who attend boarding school in Charleston. To anyone observing from the outside, Cornelius represents Southern aristocracy at its finest, educated, prosperous, refined. But in the slave quarters, they call him something else entirely. They call him the breeder. And they speak his name in whispers filled with a dread that goes beyond the normal fear enslaved people hold for their masters. Whitmore's public explanation for his plantation's unusual demographic composition is deceptively simple and, to his white contemporaries, perfectly reasonable. He claims he's conducting long-term agricultural experiments to determine whether enslaved workers born and raised on the same property, never sold away from their families, prove more productive than those purchased at auction and forced to adapt to new environments. Stability breeds contentment, and contentment breeds productivity, he writes in an 1845 essay published in the Southern Agriculturalist. He argues that keeping families together, a practice most plantation owners reject as economically inefficient, actually increases profit over time because it reduces resistance, escape attempts, and the psychological trauma that diminishes work capacity. He points to his plantation's output numbers, which are indeed impressive. His cotton yields per acre consistently exceed county averages. He presents himself as conducting a grand social experiment, proving that benevolent paternalism, as he terms it, serves the plantation economy better than harsh punishment. Other slaveholders debate his theories at county meetings. Some dismiss him as soft and sentimental. Others, intrigued by his production numbers, consider adopting his methods. What none of them know, what Whitmore carefully conceals beneath this humanitarian veneer, is that his real experiment has nothing to do with family stability or psychological contentment. His real experiment is genetic. He's not keeping families together out of kindness. He's keeping them together so he can control their reproduction across multiple generations, creating bloodlines as deliberately as horse breeders create thoroughbreds. Let's be real. What Whitmore built on his plantation wasn't just fields and slave quarters. It was an infrastructure of control designed specifically to facilitate forced breeding while maintaining complete secrecy. The plantation layout itself reveals his intentions once you understand what you're looking at. The slave quarters aren't arranged in the typical rows or clusters. Instead, they're organized into what Whitmore calls family compounds, small groupings of cabins surrounded by wooden fences, each housing what appears to be extended family units. But these aren't natural families. They're constructed breeding groups. Each compound contains one or two of Whitmore's mixed-race daughters, women born from his repeated rapes of enslaved women, along with selected male slaves and the children produced from their forced unions. Whitmore maintains meticulous records in leather-bound journals he keeps locked in his study. These aren't account books tracking cotton bales or equipment purchases. They're breeding ledgers. Each page documents an individual, name, age, physical characteristics, parentage, health history, temperament assessments, work capacity ratings, and breeding assignments. He tracks bloodlines with charts that look like livestock pedigrees. He notes when women menstruate, when they're forced to couple with assigned males, when they give birth, and which children survive infancy. He records physical measurements, height, weight, skull circumference, arm span, believing he can quantify the optimal mixture of racial characteristics. Most chillingly, he has a separate building, a locked cabin near his main house, that enslaved people call the selection house. This is where he conducts his examinations, where he determines which young women are ready for breeding, which men possess desirable traits, and which children show promise for future reproduction. When neighboring plantation owners notice the unusual number of light-skinned enslaved people on Whitmore's property, when they comment on the striking family resemblances, when they question why he never sells young adults at auction when prices are highest, Whitmore has practiced explanations ready. He claims the light-skinned population results from previous generations of mixing before he inherited the plantation. True enough on the surface, though he doesn't mention his own role in continuing and intensifying that pattern. When asked why so many enslaved women on his property are kept from field labor during certain months, he explains he's testing theories about maternal health and infant mortality rates, presenting it as humanitarian concern for maximizing the birth of healthy workers. When visitors notice that certain male slaves seem to rotate between different family compounds, Whitmore describes it as a labor management strategy, moving workers where skills are most needed. He's crafted rational-sounding explanations for every observable anomaly. He even invites other plantation owners to tour his property, confident that they'll see what he wants them to see: orderly compounds, relatively healthy enslaved people, impressive productivity. What they don't see are the locked journals, the breeding charts, the selection house, the way certain women flinch when he approaches, the dead eyes of men forced to rape women they might have chosen to love under different circumstances, women who are, unknowably to them, often their own half-sisters through Whitmore's bloodline. The whole system operates in plain sight, disguised as progressive agricultural management. Every monster needs enablers, and Cornelius Whitmore found his in Dr. Edmund Rutherford, a physician from Montgomery who visited the plantation regularly between 1844 and 1847. Rutherford wasn't some backwoods quack. He held a medical degree from Pennsylvania and had practiced in Philadelphia before moving south, where his scientific curiosity found fewer ethical constraints. He was 47 years old, bespectacled and scholarly, the kind of man who filled his conversation with Latin terminology and European medical theories. He saw himself as a man of science, an empiricist collecting data that would advance human knowledge. Whitmore paid him handsomely, not for treating sick slaves, though that was the official explanation, but for conducting what Rutherford called anthropometric assessments and what amounted to pseudo-scientific examinations of enslaved people's bodies. Rutherford measured skulls with calipers, recorded physical characteristics in minute detail, and provided Whitmore with medical opinions about which individuals possessed superior traits worth propagating. He examined pregnant women and predicted genetic outcomes based on the parents' characteristics. He kept his own parallel records, apparently intending to publish scientific papers on his findings. I want you to picture this. A trained physician, a man sworn to do no harm, spending afternoons in that selection house with measurement tools and notebooks, treating human beings as laboratory specimens, providing intellectual justification for Whitmore's breeding program by cloaking it in scientific language. Rutherford convinced himself he was conducting important research. He told Whitmore he was contributing to understanding human heredity. In reality, he was just another man using his education and authority to rationalize the unforgivable. The women at the center of this horror weren't abstractions in Whitmore's ledgers. They were human beings with names, dreams, and an unimaginable burden to carry. The primary victims were Whitmore's own daughters, born from his serial rapes of enslaved women starting in his 20s. By 1846, there were 7 of them living on the plantation, ranging from 16 to 28 years old. Sarah, the eldest, had her mother's high cheekbones and her father's green eyes, a painful mirror of her dual heritage. She'd been forced into her first breeding assignment at 15. Louisa, 24, had given birth to 6 children by 3 different men her father had selected. Mary, 19, had tried to run away twice and bore scars from the punishment. These women occupied a devastating liminal space, too visibly related to Whitmore to be worked in fields like other enslaved people, but too black to be acknowledged as his children in any legal or social sense. They lived in better cabins than field hands, wore better clothes, ate better food, and suffered a psychological torture, perhaps worse than physical brutality. They knew exactly who their father was, and they knew what he was doing to them. They were trapped in an incestuous nightmare where their own father controlled every aspect of their existence, including their reproduction. The male slaves selected as breeders carried their own trauma. Men like Jacob, a powerful field worker chosen repeatedly for breeding assignments. Men like Samuel, known for his intelligence, forced to father children with women who might have been friends or cousins if they'd had freedom to choose. These men had their autonomy stripped away, their sexuality weaponized, their potential for love corrupted into an instrument of their enslavers' eugenic fantasy. Thomas Beckworth was nobody special, just a white traveling clerk for a Montgomery textile merchant. 26 years old, moderately educated, utterly unprepared for what he witnessed. In August 1846, Beckworth arrived at Whitmore Plantation on routine business, carrying fabric samples and taking orders for winter supplies. Whitmore was away in Mobile on banking business, and his overseer, assuming Beckworth was just another tradesman, allowed him to wait in the shade near the main house. Beckworth sat on a bench under a magnolia tree, writing in his order book, when he noticed something strange. A young enslaved woman, Sarah, though he didn't know her name, emerged from a cabin escorted by an older black woman. The younger woman looked somewhere between 16 and 20, light-skinned, visibly distressed. They walked toward a separate building near the main house. Minutes later, Beckworth saw Dr. Rutherford arrive on horseback and enter the same building. Curiosity drew Beckworth closer. The building had windows, and one was partially open. What he saw through that window would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sarah, on an examination table, Rutherford conducting a physical examination while consulting a leather journal, marking notes about her readiness for breeding cycle. Beckworth heard Rutherford say, "Her third-generation characteristics are remarkable. The master will be pleased with the projected offspring quality." At that moment, the full horror clicked into place for Beckworth. The unusual demographics he'd noticed, the family resemblances, the separate compounds, the clinical detachment in Rutherford's voice. He stumbled backward, accidentally kicking a bucket, the clang echoing loud. Rutherford's head snapped toward the window. Beckworth ran. Thomas Beckworth couldn't eat for 2 days after leaving Whitmore Plantation. He paced his Montgomery boarding house room, unable to sleep, seeing Sarah's terrified face every time he closed his eyes. Now, you have to understand the impossible position Beckworth occupied. He was a clerk, not a man of influence. He had no social standing, no powerful connections, no credibility that could stand against a respected plantation owner. But his conscience wouldn't let him stay silent. On August 15, 1846, he went to the Montgomery County Sheriff, a man named Albert Crenshaw, and told him everything he'd witnessed. Crenshaw listened with an expression that shifted from interest to skepticism to barely concealed hostility. When Beckworth finished, Crenshaw leaned back in his chair and said, "Boy, you understand what you're accusing Cornelius Whitmore of. You're calling him a man who'd violate his own daughters. You got any idea what that kind of talk can do to a man's reputation, to a respectable family?" Beckworth insisted he knew what he'd seen and heard. Crenshaw's response was devastating in its casualness. "Even if what you say is true, and I ain't saying it is, you're talking about slave women, property. Whatever a man does with his property is his own business, legal and otherwise. There ain't no law against breeding slaves, son. That's just animal husbandry." Beckworth pressed harder, arguing that this went beyond normal plantation breeding, that this was something monstrous. Crenshaw stood up, signaling the conversation was over. "I'll tell you what's monstrous," he said. "What's monstrous is a clerk with no standing making wild accusations against a man who contributes more to this county's economy than you'll earn in your whole life. You go spreading these stories, you'll find yourself unemployed, and maybe worse. Now get out of my office." The sheriff, pressured perhaps by Beckworth's persistent complaints, or possibly covering himself politically, did conduct what he called an informal inquiry. He rode out to Whitmore Plantation, accompanied by a county magistrate, announced arrival, courtesy giving Whitmore time to prepare. The visit was pure theater. Whitmore greeted them warmly, expressed shock and disappointment that anyone would make such accusations, and invited them to tour the entire property. He showed them orderly slave quarters, healthy-looking enslaved people, his published essays on humane management practices. When the sheriff mentioned the specific allegations about forced breeding and incestuous relations, Whitmore produced his public breeding records, documents that showed nothing more sinister than the standard practice of controlling slave reproduction to increase property value. "Every plantation does this," Whitmore explained calmly. "We encourage healthy workers to have children. Those children become workers themselves. This isn't secret or unusual. It's basic economics." When asked about the light-skinned population, Whitmore provided the explanation he'd prepared: previous generations of mixing before his ownership. When asked about Dr. Rutherford's visits, Whitmore showed medical records documenting treatment for common ailments. The sheriff asked to speak with some enslaved people. Whitmore agreed immediately, another sign of confidence. The sheriff interviewed 3 people, carefully selected by Whitmore, who gave rehearsed answers, confirming good treatment and denying any knowledge of forced breeding beyond normal plantation practices. What could these enslaved people say anyway? Contradict their master to white authorities? Reveal secrets that might bring punishment down on themselves and their children? The system was designed to silence them. The sheriff concluded his report by stating he found no evidence of criminal activity or unusual practices beyond standard slave management common to Alabama plantations. Beckworth's accusations were dismissed as misunderstandings from an outsider unfamiliar with plantation operations. But the truth couldn't be completely hidden, not if you knew what to look for and were willing to see it. The women on Whitmore's plantation carried their trauma in ways that marked them as surely as brands. Sarah had stopped speaking entirely by 1846, communicating only in nods and shakes of her head. Louisa developed a nervous habit of scratching at her arms until they bled, creating scars she'd trace with her fingers during the rare moments when she wasn't working or under supervision. Mary's eyes held a 1,000-yard stare that anyone who's witnessed profound trauma would recognize instantly. These women moved through their days like ghosts, performing expected tasks with mechanical efficiency, while some essential part of themselves had retreated somewhere unreachable. The psychological damage extended to the children born from forced breeding. Some developed unusual attachment disorders, clinging desperately to any adult who showed them kindness. Others displayed disturbing behavioral issues, violence toward other children, self-harm, complete withdrawal. This is where the story gets truly chilling. Whitmore noticed these psychological manifestations and recorded them in his journals, not with concern or remorse, but as data points. He noted temperamental instability in third-generation subjects and speculated about whether it resulted from excessive racial mixing or insufficient maternal-infant bonding time due to work requirements. He was so consumed by his eugenic fantasy that he couldn't see, or refused to see, that he was documenting the predictable psychological consequences of systematic trauma, not genetic outcomes. The horror is that he looked at suffering he caused and saw only experimental results to analyze. Let's pull back the curtain completely on Whitmore's methodology, because understanding the systematic nature of this evil is crucial to grasping its full scope. Whitmore selected breeding pairs based on characteristics he recorded in elaborate charts: physical strength, height, skin tone, hair texture, facial features, intelligence assessments, and temperament ratings. He believed lighter skin combined with physical robustness created ideal workers, people with supposed white intelligence and black endurance. He forced selected males to impregnate multiple women on calculated schedules designed to maximize births during specific seasons when pregnant women's labor wouldn't be needed for harvest. He documented every coupling, every pregnancy, every birth, every childhood development milestone. When children reached sexual maturity, he evaluated them for future breeding potential using the same assessment criteria. Those deemed inferior, often children with disabilities or health problems, were sometimes sold away, removing defective genetics from his controlled population. Those deemed superior were kept for the next generation of his experiment. He maintained separate compounds to prevent what he called uncontrolled breeding, any sexual relationships that occurred without his permission. Guards patrolled at night to prevent enslaved people from moving between compounds. Women were examined monthly to confirm pregnancies or determine readiness for breeding. Now, I want you to picture this. Whitmore actually kept graphs tracking genetic traits across generations, trying to identify patterns, believing he was contributing to scientific understanding of human heredity. He was conducting experiments in human genetics decades before Mendel published his work on inheritance, but without any ethical constraints, without consent, and with human lives as his laboratory subjects. Into this nightmare walked Reverend Daniel Thornton, though he would have bristled at being called a hero. Thornton was a 34-year-old Methodist circuit preacher, one of those rare antebellum Southern clergymen who couldn't reconcile slavery with his understanding of Christian teaching. He was rail-thin, intense, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His family had disowned him years earlier when he began preaching about the moral stain of slavery. He survived on donations from the few white Southerners who shared his abolitionist leanings, and from free black communities he served. By 1846, Thornton had developed an underground network helping escaped slaves reach northern states, though he was careful never to explicitly confirm his involvement. He'd heard rumors about Whitmore Plantation, whispers in the slave grapevine about something worse than normal plantation cruelty, though no one could articulate exactly what. In September 1846, he met an elderly freed slave named Ruth, who'd been sold away from Whitmore's property years earlier. Ruth grabbed his hands with desperate strength and said, "Someone got to know what's happening there. Someone got to tell. That man, he ain't just a master. He's something worse. He's breeding his own children like cattle." Thornton felt something shift inside him at those words. He'd witnessed slavery's brutality his entire life, but this was different. This was a violation that went beyond economics and labor exploitation into something primordially evil. He decided to investigate, knowing the danger, understanding that his white skin and religious position gave him access that others lacked. He had no plan, no authority, no real power, just conviction and a willingness to risk everything for truth. Thornton gained access to Whitmore Plantation by doing what circuit preachers did, offering to hold Sunday services for enslaved workers, presenting himself as concerned for their spiritual welfare. Whitmore, always conscious of appearances, agreed. Allowing a preacher to minister to slaves demonstrated supposed Christian benevolence. Over 3 consecutive Sundays in late September and early October 1846, Thornton held services in a clearing near the slave quarters. He preached about Moses leading people out of bondage, about Jesus liberating captives, choosing texts that resonated with enslaved people while remaining sufficiently vague to avoid Whitmore's censure. But Thornton's real work happened in the margins. Brief conversations after services, whispered exchanges, coded messages. He learned to read the plantation's real geography. He noticed the separate compounds, the patterns of who lived where, the family resemblances that were too consistent to be coincidental. An enslaved woman named Hannah, one of the older residents who'd witnessed years of Whitmore's practices, took an enormous risk by passing Thornton a note during his 3rd visit. It simply said, "Selection House, Wednesday nights, go see." That Wednesday night, Thornton slipped back to the plantation under cover of darkness, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might give him away. He approached the selection house and peered through the window. What he saw, lit by lamplight, was shelves of leather journals, walls covered with breeding charts complete with sketched family trees, and on a desk, a journal laying open to a page describing Subject S7, Sarah, 4th breeding cycle, 3rd male, Samuel, pregnancy confirmed. Projected offspring, 5th generation primary line, estimated 75% European ancestry, optimal characteristics anticipated. Thornton stood frozen, reading page after page through the window, his entire body trembling with fury and horror. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where the evidence becomes undeniable, where the full scope of Cornelius Whitmore's systematic abuse comes into horrible focus. We're about to detail how Reverend Thornton stole documentation that would expose everything, and how close he came to dying for it. Before we continue, I need you to do something for us. I need you to comment below and tell us, do you believe stories like this should be taught in schools? Should we preserve this uncomfortable history, or is it too disturbing to confront? Because here at Echoes of Truth, we believe that forgetting atrocities guarantees they'll be repeated. We believe that facing historical horror, as painful as it is, builds the moral immunity we need to recognize evil in our own time. If you agree, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the darkest chapters of history aren't abstract, they're specific, documented, and they happen to real people with names and faces and dreams that were stolen from them. And if you're watching from Alabama, from Montgomery County especially, comment your location. These crimes happened in your communities, on land your ancestors walked. This is your history too, whether it's comfortable to claim or not. Now let's continue, because Thornton's next actions would determine whether this story ever reached anyone beyond Whitmore's property lines. Thornton knew that verbal testimony from enslaved people would never be accepted as evidence in any court or public forum. He needed documentation in Whitmore's own hand. He needed those journals. On October 15, 1846, Thornton made the most dangerous decision of his life. He returned to the plantation during a Wednesday evening when Whitmore had traveled to Montgomery for a Planters Association meeting. Information Hannah had passed him during the previous Sunday's service. The selection house was locked, but the window he'd peered through had a damaged latch. He pried it open and climbed inside, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped his candle. The room smelled of paper, ink, and something else, an antiseptic medical smell that made his stomach turn. He worked quickly, scanning journals by candlelight. The evidence was overwhelming: detailed breeding schedules, charts tracking bloodlines, Whitmore's observations about genetic outcomes, even sketches of enslaved people with measurements annotated like scientific specimens. Thornton grabbed 3 journals from different years, showing the progression of the experiment over time. He also found correspondence between Whitmore and Dr. Rutherford discussing their research and debating which breeding pairs showed most promise. He wrapped the journals in his coat and was climbing back through the window when he heard voices approaching, the overseer and a guard making rounds earlier than expected. Thornton dropped to the ground outside and pressed himself against the building's shadow, barely breathing as the 2 men passed within 10 feet of him, discussing whether they'd heard something near the selection house. They paused, checked the door, found it still locked, finally moved on. Thornton waited 20 minutes that felt like hours before sprinting toward the woods, the stolen journals pressed against his chest like precious artifacts from hell itself. Thornton reached Montgomery on October 18th with documentary evidence of systematic human rights atrocities. He went first to the county prosecutor's office, believing naively that evidence would compel action. The prosecutor, a man named Harrison Felton, examined the journals with increasing discomfort. "Where did you acquire these?" he asked. "I took them from Whitmore's plantation," Thornton admitted. "You stole them, you mean?" Felton corrected. "You committed burglary, criminal trespass, and theft of valuable property." Thornton argued that the journals documented crimes far worse than burglary. Felton closed the journals and pushed them across his desk. "Reverend Thornton, I'm going to explain something to you. What's described in these journals, even if every word is true, violates no Alabama law. Breeding slaves is legal. A white man having relations with enslaved women is not prosecuted. There is no law against incest when one party is property, you understand? Even if Cornelius Whitmore did everything written here, he committed no crime under Alabama law." The reversal was complete and devastating. Thornton had risked his life to obtain evidence that the legal system would not and could not act upon. Felton actually suggested Thornton return the journals to avoid prosecution for theft. When Thornton refused, Felton warned him, "You go public with this, you'll be the criminal, not Whitmore. He'll sue you for theft and defamation. He has lawyers and money and powerful friends. You have what? Moral outrage? That doesn't play well in Alabama courts." Thornton walked out of that office understanding that the law itself was part of the machinery of oppression, that justice would have to come from another direction. What finally triggered action wasn't law or morality, it was economics and inter-family rivalry. In late October 1846, one of Whitmore's legitimate sons, James, returned from Charleston boarding school for autumn break. At 19, James had absorbed enough abolition talk from Northern classmates to view his father's plantation with newly critical eyes. When he noticed the unusual demographic patterns and heard whispers from house slaves about the selection house, he confronted his father. Their argument escalated into a physical altercation. James left the plantation, went to his mother's family in Mobile, and revealed what he'd discovered to his uncle, Catherine Whitmore's brother. The uncle, a banker named Robert Hastings, was less concerned with morality than with family reputation and financial liability. If Whitmore's practices became public scandal, it could damage the family's social standing and business interests. Hastings leveraged his connections to force an official investigation. On November 2, 1846, a state marshal accompanied by 3 county officials arrived at Whitmore Plantation with authorization to inspect the premises, not based on Thornton's stolen evidence, but on complaints from Whitmore's own family about financial mismanagement and potential harm to family interests. What they found in the selection house shocked even hardened pro-slavery officials. the journals, the breeding charts covering walls, the examination table with restraints, detailed records of forced sexual assignments, correspondence discussing genetic experiments, evidence of systematic incestuous breeding spanning more than a decade. One official reportedly vomited upon reading the journal's detailed accounts. Another, a plantation owner himself, comfortable with slavery's routine brutalities, said later that what he saw in that building represented depravity beyond any Christian man's comprehension. The investigation into Cornelius Whitmore's background revealed a horror compounded by generational inheritance. Whitmore hadn't invented his methodology from nowhere. He'd refined practices learned from his father, Marcus Whitmore, who'd begun similar experiments in the 1820s before his death in 1838. Family papers discovered in the main house showed correspondence between father and son discussing bloodline improvement and selective propagation. Cornelius had literally inherited his father's human experiments along with the plantation itself, then systematized and expanded them with pseudo-scientific rigor. Now, you have to understand something about Dr. Edmund Rutherford that makes his complicity even more damning. Investigators discovered he'd been expelled from 2 Philadelphia medical societies in 1842 for conducting unauthorized experiments on charity hospital patients, experiments involving deliberate infection to study disease progression. He'd fled south specifically because ethical oversight was lax, because enslaved people provided an endless supply of subjects no one would legally protect. His medical journals, seized from his Montgomery residence, contained detailed anatomical sketches of enslaved women's reproductive systems, measurements taken during invasive examinations conducted without anesthesia, and theories about racial differences in pain tolerance that he used to justify his brutality. He'd been corresponding with physicians in Charleston and New Orleans, part of a loosely connected network of medical men using enslaved populations for research that would never be permitted on white subjects. The revelation exposed not just 2 individual monsters, but a broader system of medical exploitation operating throughout the South under the cover of scientific inquiry. Whitmore himself, when finally confronted by investigators, showed no remorse whatsoever. According to official reports, he defended his actions with cold rationality. "I have broken no laws. I have improved my property's value through careful management. If my methods offend certain sensibilities, that reflects their squeamishness, not my criminality." He genuinely believed he'd been conducting legitimate scientific research, that future generations would vindicate his work on human heredity. The psychological profile that emerges is chilling. Not a sadist who enjoyed causing pain, but something perhaps worse. A man so intellectually detached from his victim's humanity that he could systematically torture them while viewing himself as a progressive innovator. As investigators dug deeper into Whitmore's correspondence and financial records, the true scope of his operation emerged, revealing connections that extended far beyond one Alabama plantation. Whitmore had been in communication with at least 12 other plantation owners across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina, sharing breeding strategies and comparing results. These weren't casual letters between neighbors. They were detailed technical exchanges, complete with pedigree charts, outcome data, and theoretical discussions about optimizing genetic traits through controlled reproduction. Several plantations had apparently adopted modified versions of Whitmore's compound system after he'd described his methods in coded language through Southern agricultural journals. Financial records showed Whitmore had received substantial payments from 3 other plantation owners for consulting services, essentially teaching them his systematic breeding methodology. Most disturbingly, investigators found evidence of what amounted to a genetic exchange network. Whitmore had loaned certain enslaved men to other plantations for breeding purposes, and had similarly borrowed males with desired characteristics from other owners, all carefully documented to track bloodlines across properties. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because it reveals that Whitmore's experiment wasn't an isolated aberration. It was part of a broader antebellum phenomenon that historians still haven't fully excavated. a deliberate, systematic attempt by certain slaveholders to engage in human breeding programs designed to create more profitable enslaved populations through forced genetic selection. Records discovered in subsequent years showed similar operations on at least 7 other plantations, though Whitmore's was by far the most extensive and methodologically sophisticated. The international dimension emerged through Rutherford's correspondence with physicians in British Caribbean colonies, where similar medical exploitation of enslaved populations was occurring, and with European scientists interested in racial theory. Ideas were being exchanged across national boundaries, creating an intellectual justification network for practices that violated basic human dignity. Let's be real about what happened next, because this is where the true moral failure of antebellum Southern society becomes undeniable. Despite the horrifying evidence discovered at Whitmore Plantation, despite the detailed documentation of systematic incestuous abuse spanning more than a decade, despite testimony from enslaved people confirming the forced breeding program, no criminal charges were ever filed. The official investigation quietly concluded in December 1846 with a private settlement. The Hastings family, concerned primarily about preventing public scandal that would damage their social standing and business interests, negotiated a resolution through backroom deals with county authorities and influential planters. Whitmore agreed to cease his breeding program, agreed to sell or transfer ownership of his mixed-race daughters to other properties where their parentage wouldn't be so obvious, agreed to destroy his journals and records, though Reverend Thornton's stolen copies had already been secured elsewhere. In exchange, no criminal prosecution would be pursued, and public discussion of the matter would be suppressed. County officials cooperated with this arrangement not because they condoned Whitmore's specific practices, but because prosecuting him would require publicly acknowledging the full horror of what he'd done, which would in turn raise uncomfortable questions about slavery's broader moral legitimacy at precisely the moment when sectional tensions over slavery were intensifying toward eventual civil war. Southern newspapers, with 2 brief exceptions, never reported the story. The Montgomery press stayed completely silent, protecting local elite reputation. Only a Richmond abolitionist newspaper and a Boston publication ran accounts based on leaked information, but their reporting was dismissed in the South as Yankee propaganda and exaggeration. I want you to picture this, a crime of almost unimaginable scope and cruelty, documented in the perpetrator's own handwriting, witnessed by multiple officials, and yet systematically buried through a collective decision that protecting the institution of slavery mattered more than justice for dozens of brutalized human beings. The conspiracy of silence extended even to most enslaved people themselves, who understood that speaking openly about Whitmore's practices would bring retaliation without achieving justice. Southern society closed ranks, and the truth was entombed beneath layers of willful forgetting. The aftermath for those involved reads like a grim catalog of injustice and tragedy. Cornelius Whitmore faced no criminal charges, paid no legal penalty beyond the private settlement. He sold Whitmore Plantation in early 1847 and moved to Mobile, where his wife's family connections insulated him from social consequences. He lived comfortably until his death from pneumonia in 1854, at age 50. His obituary in the Mobile Register described him as a respected planter and agricultural innovator whose contributions to scientific farming techniques advanced Alabama's prosperity. No mention was made of his crimes. Dr. Edmund Rutherford quietly left Alabama in December 1846, resettling in Texas under a different name. He continued practicing medicine until 1852, when he was reportedly killed in a dispute with a patient's family, though details remain murky. His medical journals, seized during the investigation, were supposed to be destroyed but were actually archived in a Montgomery courthouse basement where they remained undiscovered until the 1930s. The enslaved women who'd suffered Whitmore's systematic abuse were scattered through sales to different properties. Sarah, Whitmore's eldest daughter, was sold to a plantation in Mississippi, where records show she died in 1851 at age 21. Cause of death listed simply as melancholy, a 19th-century term often used for what we'd now recognize as severe depression or suicide. Louisa ended up in Louisiana. Her fate is unknown after 1848. Mary, who'd twice tried to escape, successfully reached freedom through the Underground Railroad in 1849, aided by contacts Reverend Thornton had maintained. She eventually settled in Canada and lived until 1889, one of the few survivors who escaped to tell her story to abolition activists, though her testimony was largely dismissed as too extreme to be credible. Reverend Daniel Thay Ornton became a marked man in Alabama. Despite having exposed genuine atrocity, he was branded a thief and agitator. He continued his underground work, helping escaped slaves until 1850, when he was beaten nearly to death by a pro-slavery mob in Montgomery. He survived, but was permanently disabled, unable to continue circuit preaching. He moved north to Pennsylvania, where he spent the remaining years before the Civil War, writing and speaking about what he'd witnessed, though Southern sources worked consistently to discredit his accounts as abolitionist fabrication. The legacy of Whitmore Plantation extends far beyond the specific crimes committed on those 1,800 acres of Alabama soil. What Cornelius Whitmore documented in his meticulous journals that survive destruction and remain archived today at several universities, available to researchers willing to confront their contents, provides devastating evidence of slavery's fundamental incompatibility with human dignity. This wasn't an aberration. This was slavery's logical extreme, the ultimate expression of the principle that one human being can own another as property. When you grant absolute power over other human beings, when you remove all legal and social constraints on that power, when you create economic incentives for treating people as breeding stock, when you construct intellectual frameworks claiming scientific justification for exploitation, you create the conditions for precisely this kind of systematic horror. The broader moral lesson echoes across centuries. Systems of dehumanization, once established, inevitably produce atrocities that their architects never imagined they'd accept, yet come to defend as necessary or even progressive. Whitmore saw himself as a scientist, an innovator, a man ahead of his time. He couldn't or wouldn't recognize that he'd become something monstrous precisely because the system he operated within had normalized monstrosity. Let's be real about the contemporary implications. The eugenic thinking that guided Whitmore's breeding program didn't die with slavery. It evolved into early 20th century forced sterilization programs that targeted poor people, disabled people, and racial minorities. It informed Nazi Germany's racial purity laws. It lurks today in discussions about genetic engineering, designer babies, and reproductive technologies divorced from ethical constraints. The fundamental question, Whitmore's crime, poses remains urgently relevant. What happens when we treat human reproduction as subject to economic optimization or genetic improvement, rather than as an expression of human freedom and dignity? When we allow systematic power imbalances in reproductive decisions? When we prioritize desired outcomes over individual autonomy? The specific horror of Whitmore Plantation serves as a warning about the dangers of reducing human beings to their biological utility, of applying scientific methodology without ethical boundaries, of constructing social systems that grant some people absolute power over others' bodies and futures. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? The mechanisms that enabled Whitmore's crimes, extreme power imbalances, legal structures that classify some humans as less than fully human, institutions that prioritize economic interest over individual rights, communities that choose collective silence over uncomfortable truth. Do these exist in our world right now? And if they do, what horrors are occurring in plain sight that future generations will look back on with the same revulsion we feel toward Cornelius Whitmore? I'm not asking rhetorically. I want you to comment below with your thoughts. Where do you see power imbalances today that could enable systematic abuse? What institutions do we trust that might be concealing uncomfortable truths? What will our descendants excavate from our historical moment and wonder how we could have been so blind? This is what we do here at Echoes of Truth. We don't just tell stories about the past. We excavate truths that powerful interests tried to bury, and we ask how those truths illuminate our present. If you believe this kind of historical reckoning matters, if you believe we have to face uncomfortable truths rather than sanitize them, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that history's darkest chapters weren't abstract. They were specific crimes committed by real people against other real people whose names and faces and suffering deserve to be remembered. Drop your location in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, especially if you're from the American South, from communities built on plantation economies, from places still reckoning with slavery's legacy. Your history is part of this story too. And if you think you can handle an even darker truth, next week we're investigating the Treadwell Hospital scandal of 1858, where a Philadelphia physician conducted experimental surgeries on Irish immigrant women without anesthesia, telling them their pain would help advance medical science, while actually testing techniques for a wealthy clientele willing to pay for cosmetic procedures. Until then, remember, the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. It lives in systems we inherited and haven't yet dismantled. Stay vigilant, stay questioning, and never ever look away from uncomfortable truth.